some verses from the first chapter in the book of Ruth. I'll be reading verses 1 all the way through verse 18. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Pathrites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other named Ruth. After they had lived there for about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left with her 2 sons and without her husband. And she heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them. Naomi and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness to you as you have shown to your dead. And to me, may the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud, and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? I am going to have any more sons who could become your husband? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then give birth to sons, would you wait for them to grow up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has gone out against me." At this they wept again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied to her, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn your back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you from me." When Naomi realized that Ruth has determined to go with her, she stopped urging her.
The Old Testament story of Ruth confronts several issues that still plague our world today: the plight of immigrants, the vulnerability of women, the perils of the poor, and persistent prejudice against other people groups. As L. Daniel Hawk has said, Ruth draws us into the world of the immigrant and the powerless and invites us to see the world through their eyes. This is because, as we will see, 2 of the story's main characters represent those at the fringes of ancient Israelite society, Naomi and Ruth being widows, and moreover, Ruth also being an immigrant. On the surface of this text, these women must fend for themselves until a secure future is provided by the kindness of another. There is only ever a hint that divine provision might lie behind this tale. The story of Ruth begins in tragedy. It recalls the relocation of a family from Bethlehem in Judah to the country of Moab, where 2 sons each take a foreign Moabite wife. However, we soon find out that after 10 years of living there, the father Elimelech and his 2 sons have died, leaving behind 3 widowed women, the Bethlehemite mother Naomi and her 2 Moabite daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah. Suffice it to say, Naomi was not going to be able to provide for her daughters-in-law, or herself for that matter. So she decides to return to her homeland, Bethlehem. To our surprise, Ruth insists she will accompany Naomi. In their ancient Near Eastern context, this meant much more than a simple move. It entailed a risky journey, and more than that, a new identity. In proclaiming she will return with Naomi to her homeland, Ruth, a foreigner, must also commit to a new people and a different God. Naomi's God, our God, Yahweh. Now we don't hear much about their journey, but upon arriving in Bethlehem, Naomi and Ruth are perceived with suspicion and receive a less than warm welcome. The women of the town hardly recognize Naomi, and they aren't too sure about the foreign woman who accompanies her. It is clear Ruth and Naomi will have to fend for themselves. So Ruth sets out to glean, that is, to collect bits of grain which have been left by harvesters at the edge of the fields, a provision within ancient Israelite society and law for the needy in their society. While this was intended to serve as a means of providing for the poor, it was also a precarious situation for a woman out on her own. So we pick up at this point in the story and read in chapter 2, verses 3 to 5. So she, Ruth, set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his young man, "Who is in charge of the reapers? Whose young woman is this?" So in these verses, we learn of Ruth's seemingly serendipitous arrival at the field of Boaz, and that Boaz has already taken notice of her. You'll have to read the rest of the story, don't worry, it's only 4 chapters long. But in short, Boaz ends up providing food for Ruth and Naomi in the short term, and eventually he marries Ruth and they have a son, Obed, which provides for the women in the long term. Interestingly, throughout almost this entire story, God is never once said to speak or act. An odd characteristic for a biblical story indeed. It is not until the very end that we are told in 4:13 that God caused Ruth to conceive. So was it by chance that Ruth ended up in the field belonging to Boaz, her soon-to-be husband, who in turn fathered the future King David? You might be surprised to hear that some scholars interpret the story this way, based on Ruth 2:3, which uses the word fate or chance when it says, "And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz." In Hebrew, this verse more literally reads, "And she chanced to chance upon the part of the field belonging to Boaz." The important point being that there are actually 2 words here for chance, a noun and its verbal form. While some take this verse to mean that it was pure coincidence that Ruth came to the field of Boaz, the majority of interpreters see this as a literary tactic, subtly pointing to the divine hand. In other words, the narrator is indicating that more may be going on here than meets the eye. God is somehow involved in this fortuitous encounter. I think it is significant that the verse is open to both interpretations. For while it is true that Ruth sets out to secure their future through her own means, she could never have imagined all that would transpire as a result of her arriving at the field of Boaz. This is why 2:3 should be initially read simply as representative of Ruth's experience at that moment in the story. In Ruth's experience, she simply happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. In order to move beyond her immediate experience, one must take the narrator's perspective into consideration. The narrator has relayed the story in such a way as to leave gaps along the way. He creates ambiguity which can be settled only at the end of the book, once we learn about the birth of Obed and his descendant, King David. This enables the reader to look back and infer God's intervention in the gaps. Only in retrospect is one able to see the whole picture in order to understand that Ruth was not actually in control of putting all the elements together, which she never could have predicted or even attempted to work toward. Therefore, chance in 2:3 serves as a double entendre, encompassing the immediate human experience of chance, as well as the narrator's omniscient perspective. Perhaps just as the semantic difference in English between the word happened in its conventional use, and the alternative, when it carries a sense of something beyond chance, can be inferred only through intonation. It is possible that the original audience, who would have been familiar with the lineage of David, would have readily heard this double meaning. As the story was being told, hearing that Ruth chanced upon the field of Boaz probably would have been received as an event wrapped in the hidden providence of God, almost like a sly wink from the narrator to those in the know. Somehow, behind this ordinary meeting between two people stood God's good guidance and greater purposes. We, like Ruth, rarely if ever detect God's involvement in our day-to-day lives. We happen to come to the field or meet a new person, or by chance find ourselves in an unforeseen, fortuitous situation. Only later are we able to see all that would come about from a simple encounter on what seemed a very average day. This is because in the story of Ruth, God works through ordinary people like Boaz to bring about God's purposes and to provide for his people. Perhaps if we take the time to reflect on the mundane experiences of our lives, we can see the divine hand in retrospect as well. I suspect, as the story intimates, that the birth of her son Obed, at that point Ruth was able to see how God was working for her good all along. However, she still died without seeing the full effect of this provision. For it was much bigger than Ruth. Through this seemingly chance encounter, God would provide a king for his people David. And eventually we learn from the Gospel of Matthew that the descendant from Ruth and Boaz was not only King David, but Jesus Christ, our Lord. So we see in the story of Ruth a story about seeing God's goodness in retrospect. Though at first the characters don't recognize God's involvement in their lives, by the end of the story it appears God was working through his people to provide for the immigrant, the widow, and generations to come. Reading stories like these in the Old Testament makes the Bible more relatable to us, especially when we realize that not only this story, but all biblical accounts were written after the events they report. Thus, all biblical authors were writing regardless of whether they wrote immediately after the events they recorded or much later, from a point of retrospection, a perspective that usually makes it easier to see how God was at work. However, identifying divine involvement in this way often necessitates intentional reflection. If we aren't looking back for evidence of the divine hand, we will likely miss the blessing of seeing God's provision in our lives and lack the faith to set out on risky journeys to foreign lands or people by trusting in God's goodness. In Ruth, God uses his people to overcome evil, difficulty, and oppression in the world. But we have to have eyes to see, in retrospect, how God was at work all along. We must also trust that our efforts in this life can be used for God's kingdom long after we've gone. May it be so with us, Lord.